At 40, the silence feels heavier than the bills on the table. At 19, spending felt like freedom. At 40, the bank balance decides his mood. At 19, money was just something to enjoy. At 40, nights are spent calculating what went wrong. At 19, budgeting never even crossed his mind. At 40, debt feels like a shadow that never leaves. At 19, credit cards felt like easy money. At 40, unpaid bills quietly wait on the table. At 19, expensive clothes felt worth it. At 40, conversations about money turn into stress. At 19, parties felt like real living. At 40, the room feels quiet, but his mind isn't. At 19, gadgets felt like happiness. At 40, every expense feels heavier than it should. At 19, income disappeared as fast as it came. At 40, anxiety builds with every notification. At 19, responsibility felt far away. At 40, he stares at numbers that don't add up. At 19, discipline didn't feel necessary. At 40, stress becomes part of daily life. At 19, saving always felt like later. At 40, his credit score tells a long story. At 19, minimum payments felt enough. At 40, exhaustion comes from more than just work. At 19, spending felt like reward. At 40, every letter from the bank feels personal. At 19, impressing others felt important. At 40, nights are spent fixing old mistakes. At 19, tracking money felt boring. At 40, even small payments feel stressful. At 19, convenience came before cost. At 40, silence fills the room, but not his thoughts. At 19, small purchases felt harmless. At 40, the reality of numbers can't be ignored. At 19, subscriptions felt too small to matter. At 40, the future suddenly feels close. At 19, the future felt too far away. At 40, bills pile up quietly. At 19, trends felt more important than savings. At 40, the past shows up in every statement. At 19, impulse ruled every decision. At 40, advice finally makes sense. At 19, learning about money felt unnecessary. At 40, every decision feels like pressure. At 19, sales felt like opportunities, not traps. At 40, the consequences are real now. At 19, buy now, pay later felt smart. At 40, sleep comes late and leaves early. At 19, nights were spent without thinking ahead. At 40, anxiety sits quietly beside him. At 19, lifestyle mattered more than logic. At 40, financial stress touches every part of life. At 19, expensive things felt like success. At 40, loans become constant reminders. At 19, borrowing felt easy. At 40, obligations grow heavier every month. At 19, luxury felt normal. At 40, regret hides behind every calculation. At 19, investing felt unnecessary. At 40, the room feels empty, but the stress isn't. At 19, tomorrow felt guaranteed. At 40, even success feels incomplete. At 19, upgrades felt essential. At 40, discipline becomes survival. At 19, discipline felt optional. At 40, mistakes echo louder than ever. At 19, fun came before responsibility. At 40, debt feels endless. At 19, spending felt temporary. At 40, the future feels uncertain. At 19, saving felt unnecessary. At 40, paperwork tells a painful story. At 19, identity was built on appearances. At 40, every expense is questioned. At 19, value was never considered. At 40, nights feel longer than ever. At 19, budgeting felt pointless. At 40, another letter arrives, another reminder. At 19, impressing others felt worth it. At 40, the calculator never leaves his hand. At 19, shopping felt exciting. At 40, serious talks replace small talk. At 19, nightlife felt like freedom. At 40, every document holds a decision from the past. At 19, luxury felt harmless. At 40, retirement suddenly feels close. At 19, planning felt unnecessary. At 40, reminders never stop. At 19, money was spent instantly.